We have all been raised in the lowest total cost of ownership mindset from a supply chain perspective. It's a math issue. What's the lowest cost from A to B, with the highest customer service, greatest asset utilization, and it's a math issue. Well, now in this environment, optionality may cost you a little bit more, but it's probably going to be worth it at the end of the day.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Allied Advisors podcast. I'm your host, Justin Goethe, and I'm joined today by Mr. Dan Krouse. Dan is the founder and principal for Supply Chain Analytics consulting firm. He helps a lot of his clients navigate the complex world that is supply chain, and it's a world that's getting even more complex as a result of tariffs and trade policies that have been implemented recently. So I'm sure Dan is very much in demand these days. So we're really fortunate to be able to take 30 minutes to an hour of his time to sit down and talk tariffs and talk supply chain, and really appreciate it, Dan. Thanks for coming on the show.
No, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, really glad to have you. If you don't mind, maybe take a minute and tell the folks that are listening a little bit about your background and how you got into supply chain and what you're up to now.
Well, supply chain's pretty much been my whole career. I spent 30 plus years at Hallmark, all in operations and supply chain related roles. Got involved with purchasing and procurement early in my career, moved to Asia and Hong Kong when I was in my mid-20s, and this was before China opened up. And we were looking for supplier diversification even back then. So, this whole China plus one thing is not a new thing for me, because we were doing Hong Kong plus 5 when I was over there in the 80s. And China began to open up, and I spent a lot of time on supplier development in new countries and diversifying what Hallmark was doing. Came back and was in a marketing product development role for a while. Then I got back into the Far East. I went back as the managing director in the 90s. And there was a lot of trade issues going on at that point, with questions about China's most favored nation trade status, whether they should go into the WTO and all of those things. And I actually lobbied on behalf of China's trade status in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. So been around the barnyard a few times on trade related issues and tariffs, and came back into a procurement role, launched a global procurement initiative for Hallmark, which was somewhere around $1.5 billion in terms of spend, and that was a global initiative, and did that for a period of time. And then I went into distribution and warehousing. So I had a large footprint, lots of people, 100,000 SKUs, inbound, outbound logistics, and did that for about 10 years before I packed it in at Hallmark and decided to start doing consulting and advisory work for small to mid-market firms, still supply chain related work, but as everybody can appreciate, it's everything from raw materials to fulfillment and everything in between. So supply chain is a very broad definition. And here of late, have just been in the deep end of the pool on tariffs. People have a lot of questions, a lot of concerns. There's a lot of opportunity in the small to mid-market space, especially when organizations may not be very mature in terms of how they're handling it, with all the questions that come along with it. And so it's been great for me. And I've been doing a tremendous amount on social media with LinkedIn, and get tons of introductions that way because of all the articles I've published since Liberation Day, which are a little different. So much on LinkedIn is kind of wash, rinse, and repeat, based upon a Bloomberg article or whatever. And what I try to do is just keep my ear to the ground in terms of what I'm hearing, and then try to editorialize how those dots might be connected and what supply chain professionals ought to be looking at based upon what's in the news. And I've developed a pretty solid following from that, but I've really enjoyed it. But if you'd asked me in March if I'd be doing a lot on social media, I would have said you must be talking about somebody other than me.
I mean, I've really enjoyed following your articles. Like, I find your perspective is a little bit contrarian to some of the more mainstream perspectives that you're hearing right now in the media marketplace. So, I think it's just interesting to hear different sides of the same topic and how different people approach it.
Yeah, and some people are taking a simpler view in terms of why the administration is doing what they're doing. I tend to look at it a little bit deeper and researched a lot of the administration's trade advisors before they even went into office. What were their views? Of course, the previous administration with Bob Lighthizer, there were things that he's been very outspoken about, but there was a new guard that came in, and I thought it was important to research kind of what their views were. And it's certainly about the deficits. It's certainly about reindustrialization in the United States. How much of the manufacturing is really going to come back and what that looks like is subject for debate. It's not going to be low tech, labor intensive industries. We lost 90,000 factories and 5 million jobs over the last 20 years. And, those types of certain things are just not going to come back. It's going to be more high tech. There's going to be quite a bit of automation. It's probably going to tie to AI, semiconductors, plants that involve quite a bit of robotics, most likely. And, if the numbers are to be believed, and I think some healthy skepticism is certainly okay. The tote board on direct and foreign investment right now is somewhere north of $17 trillion, which of course is what the administration is saying, and perhaps heading towards 20. So it's going to be very interesting to see what that looks like and in what industries and those types of things. So some of which is revealing itself, most certainly. But no, the administration, it was certainly about jobs, reindustrialization, the trade deficit. But I think the one thing that wasn't obvious, but if you looked at the various people that were brought into the administration, the other very important thing is trying to maintain the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency. And they didn't come out and say that directly, but I think it's probably the ultimate end game around everything that they're doing from a tariff perspective, trying to maintain that. Maybe letting the dollar weaken a little bit, although they don't say that publicly, in order to make exports cheaper. But many countries are in the same boat, and when you see the administration react negatively to the de-dollarization transactions between certain countries and central banks buying up gold and those types of things, it's a direct threat to the dollar status. And they don't have a problem, throwing that into the mix in terms of policy deployment on tariffs themselves. And that's the part everybody has to keep in mind. There's a fundamental shift going on, but policy is all over the map, and that's the thing that drives people crazy, because it looks fairly chaotic at times based upon the decisions that are made and
the way they're communicating.
Yeah, people always ask me what do you think is going to happen? I said, well, I don't know. Today's Tuesday, tomorrow's Wednesday. And I just published an article about what happened with Canada and the Reagan Act. Trump wasn't happy about that, so we're going to cut off trade negotiations, and we may throw another tariff on top of them. And the argument I was making was he had a pretty good track record in terms of the arguments in front of the Supreme Court for the emergency authorization. And when you go down a path that doesn't look like an emergency, and it makes it look like you just got mad because of the ad that they put up about Reagan, and what he said during the Japanese situation decades ago, it doesn't help your argument too much, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. I think that's one of the gripes about the current administration, is just their communication style and the lack of warning. It's just, you come in on a Monday, and now there's an additional 30% tariff on, pick a country.
Right.
their goods coming in. And I think that, the markets can handle anything, but what they can't handle is uncertainty. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think that drives a wedge into it. And I love what you were talking about with the dollar. I mean, I read a book that was written 15 years ago talking about, it was right after the housing collapse, and the collapse of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. And they talked about the risk of the dollar bubble, right? The dollar being the reserve currency. If that changes, then, there's a lot of ripple effects
Mm-hmm.
that will
Well,
have on the overall economy.
and we had to, looking back at the history, we had to go off the gold standard because of the dollar status and the fact that there had to be more dollars in circulation in order to enable global trade. I mean, that was one of the reasons we got off the gold status.
Right.
And
That's certainly a podcast on the impact that's had on the, on U.S.
right.
market, U.S. economy, U.S. deficits.
Well, and now it's pretty obvious that they're trying to use tariffs in order to as a geopolitical risk mitigation strategy rather than, hey, we're just going to do traditional economic sanctions on you because of the Ukraine war. And those are still available to them, but part of the reason the BRICS countries got together was they didn't like the fact that, these financial sanctions were being imposed upon them, and they wanted, greater independence and to de-risk their transactions globally. And now, of course, they're doing more bilateral trading that's settled in a different currency. And but it's going to be interesting to see how a lot of this unfolds in the coming months and years. So,
what do you think about that? I mean, you talk about how it unfolds in the coming months and years. A lot of the talk right now is on the U.S.-China trade war, but a lot of mid-market manufacturers are struggling with tariffs, not on China, but on allied countries, right? Canada, you mentioned, Mexico, Europe. How should these supply chain executives trying to manage this situation, should they view this as a short-term issue that will be resolved maybe in future years with a different administration? Or do you think the current administration is setting a tone that will be followed up with administrations from maybe, a different political party? When there's not a Republican in office, when there's a Democrat, are we still going to see these tariffs?
well, my own view is the underlying dynamics around geopolitical tensions, the trade imbalances, where things are going to be produced globally, and the dynamics of those trade lanes, et cetera. Those are the underpinnings that really aren't going to probably change much, So I think that's foundational for this being a longer term structural issue rather than just a near term issue because, Trump likes tariffs, and you hear that all the time, and he clearly does.
Right.
But the other component to this, which is, depending on what happens with the Supreme Court ruling and everything else, you're looking at somewhere annually between 200 and 400 billion dollars in terms of tariff revenue. And it doesn't seem to me that whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration that they're going to be able to walk away from that kind of money easily. You look at what happened with the China tariffs when Biden came into office. They kept them in place.
Yeah, nothing.
And they weren't insignificant, but you go back and look at the math, and ultimately it ended up being 0.5% impact on consumer pricing. And part of that has to do with, what companies absorb, but it also has to do with China potentially manipulating their currency or subsidizing factories in order to keep open. And now, China's got a bit of an overcapacity situation going on, and everybody's watching that very closely. But I think it's here to stay.
Well, let me ask you this: when you talk about $200 to $250 billion in additional revenue coming into the government's coffers as a result of tariffs, how much of that do you think changes over the course of time as manufacturers adjust? Right? I mean, these tariffs came on sudden. I think it's a fair description, and have caught a lot of manufacturers flat-footed. But over the course of time, they're gonna govern themselves accordingly, right? They're gonna make decisions with these tariffs in mind. I would think that 250 billion goes down over time. What are your thoughts?
I think it depends on how the trade lanes and where things are imported, how that changes over time.
Right.
I've published a few articles where I've talked about the administration. I think and again, this was with some of the people that are involved with the administration from a trade perspective, what they published early on. But they were trying to put everybody into one of three buckets. Okay, here's friends and family in bucket one. We like you. We've got a long-term relationship. UK, EU, Japan, South Korea, and you're going to get preferential treatment because of national security issues, because of all kinds of things go into that determination. So you look at that and say, okay, that's probably 10 to 15%. Mm-hmm. Then you got the middle bucket, which is I would describe kind of as trading partners. So you've got Mexico and Canada in there, and you might have India and potentially Brazil, although we're in neutral corners right now with Brazil. Nobody seems to be happy with each other.
Right.
And, who's in that middle bucket can change. So you're probably talking about north of 15% there and maybe less than, 25. And then you've got the third bucket, which is best described as strategic competitors, or the penalty box, as I call it. And you've got China, potentially Russia, and other countries that are probably going to be north of 25%. And some have argued that you get north of 35, you're basically telling the country we don't want to do business with you. And that's the part that we really don't know at this point is, how that's all going to pan out. But when you look at those buckets, and I don't think that's probably going to change very much, companies' ability to move things around into nearshoring, friendshoring, and those types of things where perhaps those tariffs are less, obviously that's going to have downward pressure on that 200 to 250 billion. Mm-hmm. And it may take it from 400 down to 200, but it's still a big number, ultimately at the end of the day. And any kind of direct foreign investment, the 17 trillion or 20 trillion, whatever it happens to be, regardless of what those industries are, that takes years, to come online, where there's the ability to see that number go down. And of course, they're saying, hey, you won't have it if you produce domestically. But depending on the industry, you don't really know how the math's going to work on that. So
and I guess if you produce domestically, it's still a benefit for the government because they then they make taxes off of you, right? Then they get a cut of the profits.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a win-win either way for Americans. I've had people tell me in the past, to grow an economy in real terms, you either grow it, mine it, or make it, right? That's how you grow an economy. That's how, third world countries rise to, developed countries as they improve and which is what China's done, right? You improve either your manufacturing sector, your agriculture sector, or your mining and mineral sector. So anyway, I definitely can see the long-term benefits of reshoring for the American economy, although it's certainly causing its fair share of pain now.
Well, and China's a juggernaut. There's just no doubt about it in terms of what they're doing with their factories and their technology and, robotics and a variety of things. And, it's like, well, they've got, 1.5 billion people. Why are they doing so much with robotics? Well, their reproduction rates are down and they've got to be able to maintain that economy. And, right. I'm not the first one to suggest it, but a lot of people view China as just one big employment agency, and they've got to keep people working in order to avoid civil unrest and a variety of other things. So, and that's one of the things that I've been a little bit surprised by is, in terms of working with companies, I always say, well, if you talk to the manufacturer about shared pain, no, we haven't done that. Well, that's the first thing you should do before you do anything else. So that's been an interesting phenomenon.
You write, I've read several of your articles, and you talk about classifying companies in terms of maturity in dealing with tariffs, immature versus very mature. What constitutes a very mature strategic tariff policy in your eyes in 2025? And then how can mid-market manufacturers who might be a little bit more strapped in the resource department, how can they start moving towards that?
Well, I think the companies that are doing this more on a strategic basis, it's kind of front and center in terms of the C-suite and decisions that are being made across the business. It's what are our tariff mitigation strategies? Are we looking at how we design products in order to keep the tariffs low? What's our competition doing, or how much of this are we absorbing or trying to pass on to our customers? And then more broadly, what's your diversification plan in terms of where things are either bought or made, and all the different trade lanes and everything else that's associated with that? Are you doing scenario development where you have a number at the front end and the back end of every one of those scenarios, and you've got triggering events along the way that will trigger from you going to plan A to plan B? And what are those things that have to happen? And is that being discussed at the leadership level? Maybe you've got a full-blown trade compliance group. Maybe you're looking at free trade zones and bonded warehouses and duty drawbacks and a variety of things. Are you constantly auditing your tariff classification codes and those types of things? And then on the immature side, it's more of a company that's being very reactive. They're not doing scenario planning. They're maybe not looking at enough alternatives in terms of their sourcing strategy. Sometimes they don't even know what their tariff exposure is. I've talked to companies that buy domestically through distributors, and they go, "Well, I really don't think I have anything." And 2 weeks later, they call me up and say, "I'm in big trouble because I'm getting letters because of tier 2 and tier 3 exposure with their suppliers that they didn't know even existed." Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think it's just important also to make sure you've got, good customs brokers, utilize trade attorneys when you need to, because this is obviously a growing phenomenon for them in order to try to stay on top of these issues. But I'd say for the mid-market folks, it starts with the basics. What's your exposure? Have you audited your classification codes? Do you feel like those are accurate? Are you getting third-party advice around that? What are you doing in terms of diversifying where you're getting from, and where are you going in the short term and the long term with that diversification? Are you bringing anything back? Are you trying to, explore Mexico? Are you placing orders with alternative suppliers? Because you've got to start somewhere. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It can just be some small orders to see how a new supplier performs. It doesn't mean that you have to make a major shift.
I mean, it sounds like, to me, when I hear you saying all that, I'm just trying to apply it in practical, this is what you actually got to do today terms. I mean, it sounds like there needs to be a review of the org structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who do we have employed, and do we have the right talent? Are they here, right? Do we have somebody who understands the compliant piece? And maybe that's not a W-2 employee, maybe that's a third party, but do we have somebody that can help us on the compliance piece? Yep. Do we have our procurement team looking at multiple supplier scenarios with multiple geographic regions, right? Asia Pacific, Latin America, Mexico, Canada, domestic. And then the third thing is, are our finance folks looking at our exposure and being able to model out, based on the scenarios that procurement has identified, what that could mean for the company in a long-term scenario, and then being able to put together a program that would allow you to switch, right? So it seems like you might want to be doing a lot of dual sourcing in different geographic areas, so that as tariffs you can shift, right? So I might have a Indian supplier and a Mexican supplier, and depending on what tariffs do is how I direct my volumes. Does that kind of sound like a something that,
Absolutely. Yeah.
okay,
And really trying to figure out, okay, what are going to be those triggering events that cause you to make a major change on one of your scenarios that you've developed. And I always
right,
tell people, hey, you don't need 20 scenarios. First of all, most organizations can't deal
can
with that
handle
many,
it.
but develop the scenarios based upon the countries that you're looking at and what may happen.
Right,
And and I've stated on a number of occasions, if it's high labor items, okay, the winners in all of this are probably going to end up being India and Mexico, um, because those are the next best alternatives
right,
for where stuff's getting made in addition to Vietnam. So I'd say probably those three countries are the big winners. If it's more low labor, high tech, you're really talking about Japan, South Korea, Canada, potentially, maybe some in Mexico, and then just, reshoring back to the US. But, what's the timeline on that's going to look like? That's really the other question. So,
so you're talking about who do we have, what do we want them to do, right? And then what are the deliverables for those activities? Those are
sure.
really kind of the three things we're really trying
Yeah.
to define when we start talking about putting together a strategy.
Yeah. And and that's basically what I've been doing. I always start with an assessment, okay, where are you? And my assessment and recommendations around tariff mitigation strategies is anywhere from 30 to 90 days, depending on the size and scope of the business and what's going on. Sometimes I get asked, a direct question by somebody and they need an answer in a day or two. Like,
Right.
hey, I got this offer that's too good to be true, and generally it is. And I can look at it and pretty quickly determine you're probably running an inordinate amount of risk for transshipping or something based upon that, and you probably need to avoid doing that. That could be one example. Another example might be somebody that's um, uh, dedicated supplier, and they're doing delivered duty paid. Well, what do you know about the freight forwarders and the people that are doing it? You need to review that. What do your contracts look like? Those are simpler things. But if there's significant import exposure through multiple lanes, multiple countries, materials, imported products, those types of things, it can get pretty complicated, and that takes a little bit more time.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to some points. Again, we talked about at the beginning of the show how I think you're a bit of a contrarian because a lot of people are describing these tariffs as a financial problem. But what you've laid out here is they're actually an operational problem, meaning that you probably don't have processes in place on the design side to make sure that you're looking at designing products that you could source from low risk tariff countries. You probably don't have processes on the sourcing side to quantify tariff risks before making supplier decisions, right? So it's more of an operational commercial operations piece than it is just a duty drawback or a financial problem to solve.
Right. And I think the broader you can address it across your organization in terms of, because ultimately it's very possible that these costs are going to have to be absorbed to a certain point. So the broader view always helps you figure out where else can we make this up? Can
Yeah.
we make it up through more lean manufacturing initiatives? Can we make it up through, doing something different with our inventory policy, how that is going to affect customer service, turn rates, asset utilization, a whole host of things. And, you see a lot of organizations that might be hit with 15 or 20%, and they're passing 4% on to their customer, so there's a pretty big delta there. Well, what else are you doing to make up the margins that you just lost?
Yeah, I
And
mean, that's what I was thinking as you were talking. I'm like, companies that are very mature in lean, meaning they have a culture where that standards matter, right? Their processes
Mhm.
are defined by standards. they're going to have a competitive advantage here because they're going to be able to look at that standard and say, how does this need to change in my new environment, and make very smart strategic decisions moving forward. Whereas someone who doesn't have that culture and they don't have a standard, they don't know where to start, right? I mean,
Right.
they're kind of lost. So they've
Hmm.
got to get
Yeah,
caught up before they can ever start incorporating some of these strategies.
that's very true. And but the ones that are tackling it more at a strategic level are certainly better positioned competitively. They're building resilience into their supply chain. They're building optionality into their supply chain and their decisions. And so they're in a much better position. They probably have a really good idea in terms of what their competition's doing, which is another key component to this. And they're just overall in a better position to deal with these issues when they arise.
Yeah, you were talking about, we've talked a lot about how politics has really kind of, they'll stick around, but the politics has kind of been a main driver for some of these tariff risks. And I think some executives are taking one of two paths here. There are those executives that are going straight to the government leaders and lobbying for different tariff policy. Hey, these tariffs are killing me. You got to give me some relief here. I don't know that that's the smartest path. I think the other path is exactly what you're talking about. Hey, we need to focus on what we can focus on in-house. How are we designing materials? How are we setting up these processes? How do we mitigate this through using dual sourcing? That seems to be a much better strategy.
Yeah, and I think the bigger companies are doing both. I think the administration does want to hear from the major players because I think they're trying to be flexible and pragmatic around some of these things. So, like I said, I think the bigger companies are doing that, but they're also saying, hey, if this doesn't change, we have to do some stuff to change it. The smaller to mid-market companies, unless they're part of a consortium or an association or something, they really don't have the wherewithal to, lobby Washington in order to, deal with some of these trade policies. But I do think that there, there is going to be some pragmatism at the end of the day in terms of, hey, we're not going to be perfect on this, so as things arise, we have to quickly pivot if this is going to affect something. And, don't even get me started on unintended consequences around all of this. I mean, it's just where does that begin and end? I mean, it's a long laundry list of things. And, I've had a lot of discussions over the last few weeks because of the negotiations we're heading into with China around soybeans, and that's a pretty big deal. We obviously can't continue to subsidize farmers. We need to have their markets front and center in terms of all of these discussions so they don't get left out of it. And you just end up saying, well, we got 200 billion. We'll start giving money to the farmers to subsidize them. That's fine, but that's not where those types of exports in critical industry should be in this whole dialogue. So I'm optimistic we're going to be selling more soybeans. I can tell you that.
So I'm unfamiliar with that topic. Can you maybe go into a little bit more detail on it?
Well, the part of there was an investigation launched recently that indicated, well, maybe China didn't do everything they were supposed to do with the last ag purchase. And the foreign markets for certain agricultural products are really, really important to the farmers. And, so where that stuff goes, being part of these bilateral discussions is really important. If there's a market for us to export, and, certain countries are they've got very strong protections in place, depending on what it is that they grow domestically. And, you can get into all kinds of various ag products like milk in Canada, rice in Japan, these types of things. And Canada's got strong protections in place. So I think the issues for wherever we have an export market that's critical for us to avoid farmer subsidies. I think it's, like I said, I think it's important for that to be kind of front and center, and sometimes it's not. But we don't want too many shoestring catches. Hopefully they'll get some commitments out of China to buy more soybeans, and that'll help.
Otherwise, the government's going to be under pressure to subsidize the farmers, which is not going to help with
They absolutely will, for sure. Yeah,
got it.
They absolutely will.
You know, we've talked a lot about the uncertainties that these tariffs have brought on mid-market manufacturers, but whenever there's uncertainty, there's also opportunity, right? I mean, there are those who are going to adjust quickly, who are going to see opportunities where others see risk, and they're going to come out, better on the other side of this than some of their competition. In your mind, what does that look like for mid-market manufacturers? What are the opportunities that these executives maybe aren't seeing that you would say, hey, I think if you could do X, Y, and Z, and we already talked about, the dual sourcing and some of these other strategies, but is there something else that they could look at and say, yeah, let's go after that because that's going to put us in a better position moving forward?
I think a key one is new markets and new products, either on the export side or other things that they can put in place to help their top and bottom line. I think that's a key component of this. But the ones I'm most fearful of are small companies that are heavily dependent on cheap imports from China. That's the one I'm most concerned about. As the companies get bigger, they're going to look at the things more strategically. What SKUs can we add? Where are those things coming from? What are the potential margins around it? But again, getting back to some of it is oftentimes a design issue that can help you mitigate the tariff exposure as well. Yeah, it's kind of the whole front to back look across the entire business, from revenue to our various cost elements and what market are we in and what other things can we explore that will help offset some of this. I think that's really the big key. So
Gotcha. So, maybe if you could give three things, three pieces of advice to CEOs or supply chain managers out there trying to figure out how to navigate, tariffs and everything that they're looking at. What would those three, I would say quick wins, but they're probably not quick. But what are the three most important things you would tell them to do?
I'd say the big ones are the diversification issue in terms of where you're going with your imports, short term and long term, and that includes raw materials to subassemblies, components, finished product. So what does that look like, and do we have the right people in place that can support those elements? So I would say those three elements, and then that would be one, kind of the whole diversification issue. The other issue is what technologies do we have that are in place that can help stay on top of this, kind of tariff monitoring solutions, and those are being added all the time. Do we feel good about our customs brokers and those types of things, and freight forwarders, the people that are helping us with the movement of goods? But the technology aspect of this is growing pretty quickly. And then the last bit of advice is keep it front and center. Keep it a C-suite issue, where as these things change and evolve over time, and for most organizations, supply chain is a C-suite issue if they're importing or manufacturing or wholesaling product, and leadership is represented at that level in many organizations. But oftentimes this whole trade compliance issue and tariffs and things like that were pushed down into the organization because out of sight, out of mind for the last 20 years. Well, now you've got to pull that up and make it more of an ongoing discussion. And that leads to better scenarios, better decisions, but also a more educated leadership team in terms of all of these issues. And, I talk to people all the time that are either business owners, trusted advisors, or people that just want to know more because they're, interested in this and they're curious about how it's going to affect their pocketbook. So I talk to people in every category out there almost.
Awesome. So three things, just summarizing, is making sure that you've got the procurement team in place that's able to, long-term model out different scenarios and where they need to go to.
Yep.
the second thing is making sure you've got the right partners in place that you understand your exposure and technology that can make that real time, because these changes are happening. You come in and the tariffs have been
Exactly.
coming to
Right.
work today and the tariffs are different. So you got to
Yep.
have the right technology in place to monitor that. And then the third thing is stay involved, right? C-suite needs to stay involved in this supply chain issue because it's not going away. It's going to continue. And if you're not plugged into it, you could very quickly wind up seeing a
Well,
massive.
and the other thing too is, typically from a supply chain perspective, and this is again a mindset issue.
Mm-hmm.
We have all been raised in the lowest total cost of ownership mindset from a supply chain perspective. It's a math issue. What's the lowest cost from A to B? With the highest customer service, greatest asset utilization, and it's a math issue. Well, now in this environment, optionality may cost you a little bit more, but it's probably going to be worth it at the end of the day. So it's important to say this is not just purely a cost issue anymore. It's also a risk mitigation issue. It's a strategic issue for the company. It's how are we going to remain competitive moving forward? So, and you got to kind of pull the whole organization in that direction in order to manage it effectively.
And the case you're making there, Dan, just to make sure I understand it, is look, you might look at two scenarios, and today it looks like scenario A is a lower total cost of ownership than scenario B. But you also have to factor in the risk that there could be a tariff switch, or there could be political pressures that would make option A very much less attractive.
Sure.
And maybe it's worth paying a little extra for option B due to the decreased risk for this overall supply chain.
You use China as an example. I mean, China is still probably the cheapest game in town compared to depending on what it is you're making and exporting from there. But hey, are you willing to pay 10% more in another country for 25% of your volume? To me,
Right.
that's a C-suite discussion,
Yeah.
and depending upon the criticality of what you're bringing in, it might be a very easy decision for some organizations to make around this whole notion of resilience. Might have to pay a little bit more to have it, but it's not necessarily a bad thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that buzzword you just dropped there, supply chain resilience. I mean, this isn't the first time I've heard that in the last 5 years, right? I mean, going all the way back to COVID, I think we found out that supply chain resilience is worth something. Maybe it's a little bit difficult to quantify at times, but we have found out that it definitely has value.
Well, and when you have those options and you're deploying those various strategies and cost elements, that again is a testament to why the C-suite needs to be involved. Laying all of that out. So,
well, Dan, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. I definitely feel smarter after spending this 45 minutes with you. Thanks again for taking the time to meet with us. Before you go, if folks want to connect with you or follow up with you, how should they go about doing that? How can they reach out?
Well, I've got an online calendar on LinkedIn. If people want to reach out to me and get 30 minutes on the phone with me to talk about their situation, that's fine. My website link is on LinkedIn as well. If people are interested, I can share with them kind of my approach in that 30 to 90 day assessment and mitigation strategy. And most of the time I start with a few conversations to understand their circumstance, and then is there an opportunity for me to help them further? And again, tariffs is one element of what I do. I usually do assessment and people process work with everything that I do, and coaching and mentoring supply chain people along the way with my engagements is one of the things that I enjoy doing at all levels of the organization. And, as we've talked about, supply chain is very broad, and there can be 1,000 pain points associated with what's going on with supply chain. But I usually use that initial phase to really understand what's going on and what are the most critical steps that an organization needs to take moving forward. And sometimes it's structural, sometimes it's process, sometimes it's external relationships. You know, tariffs has been a good lead into a lot of groups that I'm interacting with now. But I always tell people it's more than just tariffs. You know, there's a lot going on from a supply chain perspective. But I do enjoy working with business owners, supply chain leaders. And that's kind of the beauty of small to mid market. You're typically dealing directly with the business owners and trying to figure out what's going on with their companies and how I can help them.
Yeah. And we'll include links to your LinkedIn page, to your website, to your I'm assuming you're using Calendly, but we'll include links to all that in the show notes. So if anybody wants to reach out to Dan, I would highly encourage it. Obviously, he's a wealth of information when it comes to resilient supply chains. And that's definitely something I know that all of our listeners are very tuned into right now. So Dan, again, thanks so much for the time. Really enjoyed the conversation. And, I'd love to do this again in the future, and maybe let's take a look back in 6 months and see where we're at on the tariff situation, and maybe review it.
That'd be great. It's all going to probably look a little different in 3 to 6 months for sure.
I mean, if the past 3 to 6 months is any indication, yes, I 100% agree with you. You are correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, folks, if you've enjoyed this conversation with Dan and I, please do like and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a 5-star review or on Apple iTunes or Spotify. It really does help us get the show out there. And Dan, again, thanks again for the time.
No, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, take care.